My name is Emile Thibodeau. I was born in the parish of Terrebonne, Louisiana, in the year 1869, and I have lived my entire life within sight of the Bayou. I say this so you understand that I am not a man given to fancies. I know the cypress trees in every season. I know the sound the water makes when the current shifts. And I know the silence that falls over the marsh at 3 in the morning when the frogs stop calling all at once. That silence is a warning. It took me 40 years and the ruin of everything I had built to understand what it was warning about. I am dictating this account to my nephew Alcide in the spring of 1924. The events I am about to describe took place in the autumn and early winter of 1903 on the farm my father built on Bayou in Terrebonne Parish. I have not spoken of them to any person outside my family in the years between. I speak now because I am old, and because the weight of knowing without speaking has become heavier than the shame of being believed a fool. If you have found your way to these archives and you wish to remain, subscribe now. There are many more records that have waited far longer than this one to be heard. My father, Théodule Thibodeau, came to Bayou from the Atchafalaya Basin in 1861, the year the war began, though he was too old and too practical to fight in it. He cleared 2 acres from the cypress swamp by hand, built a house on pilings the way every sensible man in that country built his house, and raised pigs, chickens, and a small kitchen garden that my mother tended with the kind of disciplined love she gave to everything she cared about. By the time I was grown, he had added a barn, a smokehouse, a proper dock extending 20 feet over the bayou, and a second pasture cleared to the southeast, where we kept 4 milk cows, and in the good years, a pair of horses. I married Celeste Arsino in 1895. She was a practical woman, the daughter of a trapper from the basin, and she had grown up with a working knowledge of the swamp that matched my own. We had 3 children by 1903. My son Théodule, named for my father, who was then 6 years old, my daughter Marguerite, who was 4, and an infant boy we had christened only in September of that year. The parish record of that baptism survives in the church at Hauma. If anyone should wish to verify that these were real people living a real life in a real place, which I understand is the first thing a skeptical man reaches for, the autumn of 1903 had been hot later into the season than usual. The mosquitoes stayed thick into October, which the old people said was a bad sign, though they never said precisely for what. The bayou itself was low from a dry summer, and the mud banks on either side stood exposed in broad shelves of cracked red clay and pale sand, pocked with the prints of herons and nutria, and the occasional alligator drag mark. The country had the particular stillness of a place that is waiting for something, though if you had asked me to say what, I could not have told you. The Rougarou was not a subject we discussed openly in our household, but it was there, beneath every conversation about the swamp, the way bedrock is beneath soil. You do not think about bedrock, but it shapes everything that grows above it. My father had spoken of the Rougarou twice in my memory, and both times he had chosen his words with the particular careful flatness men use when they are speaking of things they do not wish to make more real by naming. The Rougarou, as the old Cajun people knew it, was a creature of the swamp margin, the place where land and water could not agree on where one ended and the other began. It walked upright, as men walk, but it was not a man. It came when a sin had been committed and gone unconfessed. That was the story. That was what the grandmothers told, and what their grandmothers had told before them, back through a chain of tellings that reached the swamps of Acadia, and before that, perhaps, to something older. and less named. I am not a superstitious man. I want that on the record. I had been educated through the 6th standard at the parish school in Houma, and had read enough of the world to know that creatures from stories are creatures from stories. I had seen the things the swamp actually produced, and they were frightening enough on their own terms without supernatural additions. But there is a moment, which I will come to, when a man's education and a man's certainty part ways with what his eyes are telling him. When that happens, you discover which one he trusts. The first death was a pig. I will not deceive you into thinking I recognized it for what it was at the time. I walked out on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of October and found the largest of our breeding sows dead against the far fence of the pen. She weighed perhaps 240 pounds. Something had opened her and left her there. There were no tracks in the pen that I could make sense of, only a broad disturbance of the mud, as though something very large had moved through quickly. And at the fence line, where the lower rail was cracked, a smell. I want to describe that smell because it is the detail that, even now, I cannot set aside. It was not blood, though blood was present. It was beneath the blood, deeper than it, like a wet animal smell, but wrong in its particulars. Heavier, muskier, with something sweet underneath that had no business being sweet, the way rot can fool you in the moment before your stomach catches up with your nose. I have smelled alligator musk. I have smelled the den of a black bear. I have cleaned the carcasses of deer and hogs and cattle. None of those smells had this quality. It was the smell of something that did not belong in any category I had a name for, and it came from the direction of the Bayou. My neighbor, Donat Fontenot, came over that afternoon at my request. He was 63 years old that autumn, a widower, and he had worked this stretch of Bayou country his entire life. He looked at the sow, he looked at the pen. He walked to the fence line and crouched down without speaking, and I watched him study the ground for a long time. When he stood up, he did not look at me directly. He looked toward the tree line at the edge of my property, where the cleared land ended and the bayou margin began. He said, "You got any trouble with your conscience lately, Emile?" I thought he was making a joke. He was not. He said, "There is something in the wood that has taken an interest in your place." He said it the way you report a weather observation, plainly and without ornament. Then he told me to bring my family inside before dark for a period of some weeks, and to see the priest in Houma as soon as I could arrange it. He would say nothing else specific. He walked home along the bayou path, and I watched him go, and I was angry in the way you are angry when a man knows something and will not tell it to you plainly. I did not go to the priest. I was a practical man, as I have said. The second death was a chicken. Then 2 more chickens. Then, 6 days after the sow, one of our milk cows, a black and white animal my children had named Josephine, was found at the edge of the south pasture on the fence side nearest the bayou. What had been done to her was worse than the sow. I will not detail it fully, except to say that an animal of that size and weight had been moved, and moved quickly, and what remained was arranged in a way that animals do not arrange things. Celeste found me at the fence, staring at the ground, and she stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Emile, you need to listen to what Donna told you. Celeste was not a woman who spoke from fear. When she spoke to you in that voice, measured, a little quiet, you had learned to listen." I went to the priest in Houma that week. Father Arcand was a practical Creole man in his 50s, who had heard a great many things in the confessional, and who did not, I think, believe the Rougarou was a supernatural creature in any strict theological sense. But he did not dismiss what I told him. He said that in his experience, the accounts of this type that came to him from the Bayou parishes tended to follow a pattern, and that the pattern, whatever its ultimate origin, was real enough in its effects that ignoring it was unwise. He gave me a blessed candle and a bottle of holy water. He said to keep the animals penned near the house, to never go out after full dark alone, and to confess anything that needed confessing. He also told me the older details of the legend, the ones my father had never said plainly. The Rougarou, in the deep Cajun tradition, was not simply a predator. It was purposive. It tested. It began with animals, always with animals, and if it was not stopped, it moved closer. It learned the layout of a property, the rhythms of those who lived there, the places where the light did not reach. And then, when it was ready, it came for the family. The priest said he did not know what it was. He said, "Only God knows what moves in those waters." But he told me to take it seriously. I left Hauma with the candle and the holy water and an appointment for confession the following Sunday, and I drove the wagon home along the Bayou road in the dark. And I watched the tree line the whole way, and nothing looked back at me that I could see. For 11 days after the cow, nothing happened. That pause was the worst part. A man can keep a vigil for a week. He can sustain alertness, check the perimeter, lie awake listening, but 11 days of nothing begins to do something to a person's certainty. You start to negotiate with yourself. You start to build the case for the alligator that got the sow, the wildcat that got the chickens, some larger animal you haven't identified that got the cow, and moved on. The mind wants a framework it can live with. It builds one whether the evidence supports it or not. By the 9th day, I had halfway built myself an alligator large enough to account for everything, and I had almost convinced myself of it. On the 12th night, something came to the house. I was awake. I will say that plainly, because I wanted on record that I did not dream this. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, because the baby had been restless, and I had taken him from Celeste so she could sleep. I was holding him against my shoulder in the way you do, patting his back, staring at nothing in particular. The dog, a mixed hound we called Brasseur, was asleep on the floor near the door. He had been sleeping there each night for the past week, because he would not go outside after dark. Dogs are not given to fancy either. That had told me more than the priest had. At approximately 2 in the morning, Brasseur woke. He did not bark. He rose from the floor very slowly, the way a dog does when it smells something it does not know how to respond to, and he pressed himself against the far wall of the kitchen, away from the door. And he looked at the door, and he did not make a sound. I have owned dogs since childhood. I have never seen one behave this way. Brasseur was not a timid animal. He had held a 6-foot alligator at the water's edge the previous spring without flinching. He was pressing himself against the wall with his belly flat and his ears down, and he was trembling. I set the baby on the kitchen table, propped against the wall, and I went to the mantel for the shotgun. The gun was a 12-gauge that had belonged to my father, and it was loaded, and I had kept it loaded every night since the cow. I stood in the center of the kitchen, and I waited. The smell came first. It came under the door, through the gap between the sill and the plank, the same smell from the pen, sweet and rotten and musky and wrong. It filled the kitchen within the span of 3 or 4 breaths, and the baby, who had been starting to settle, began to cry in that high, helpless way infants cry when something has frightened them and they do not know what it is. I was across the room and had him against my chest before I had consciously decided to move. Whatever was outside the door stayed there for a long time. I cannot tell you with precision how long, because time does the thing it does in those moments. It expands into something elastic and unreliable. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. I stood in the kitchen with the baby against my chest and the shotgun in my other hand, and I breathed through my mouth against the smell, and I watched the door. Brasseur did not move from the wall. Then I heard it. Not a sound I can give you a name for, not a howl, not a growl, not anything that fits a word I have available. It was low and it was sustained, and it had a quality, I am going to say this and you can believe it or not, it had a quality that was almost like language, not words, not any human speech. But it had the shape of intention in the way a voice has the shape of intention, and what it intended I could not understand, and I found that I did not want to. Then it stopped. Then there was nothing. Then Brasseur walked back to the door and lay down against it, which was the thing he normally did when he felt the house was safe. I stood there for another 10 minutes before I lowered the gun. Celeste was awake. I knew she was awake because I heard the creak of the bedroom floorboard that only sounded when she stood, but she did not come out, and I did not go in, and neither of us spoke, and that silence was its own kind of conversation between people who have been married long enough to have that kind of exchange. In the morning, I went outside with the shotgun before anyone else was up. I found mud on the porch, not rain mud, not the tracked mud of boots, wide, flat impressions pressed into the boards without the heel and toe shape of any foot I knew. Along the side of the house where the bedroom window faced, the window shutter had been moved, not opened, moved. The wood of the shutter had contact marks in it at roughly shoulder height, as though something had rested a weight against it from the outside, and had stood there in the dark, close to the window, long enough to leave a mark. I went to Donat Fontenot that morning and told him everything. He listened to me in the yard outside his house, and when I was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Has it seen the children?" I said, "I didn't know." He said, "If it has seen the children, you need to move them tonight." I said, "Donat, what is it?" He said, "It is what the old people said it is." He said it was not the animal the legends described, or not only that, he said the versions he had been told by his grandmother, who had been born in the basin before the war, described something that was drawn to households by specific conditions, and that once it had claimed a property, it would not leave without intervention. The intervention was ritualized, and it involved the priest, and it involved a specific process of marking the property that the old Acadians had carried with them across the water, and that the church, in his grandmother's experience, had tolerated without fully endorsing. He said he would go with me to Father Arcand, and he said to keep everyone inside until we had done so. He also told me something that I have held at the center of my account of these events, because it is the detail I cannot explain away, no matter how long I have tried. He said that in the 3 accounts he knew of personally, accounts from men he had believed, the creature had been described in each case as making a sound outside the house that all 3 men had described the same way, though none of them had ever spoken to each other about it. They had all described something that sounded almost like a voice. I had not used that word to him. I had not told him it had a quality like language. He volunteered it without any prompting from me, and when he said it, I felt the hair on my arms stand up in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Father Arcand came out to the property 3 days later. He came with a younger priest I did not know, and they walked the entire perimeter of the property together, praying in Latin and marking specific points at the property line with a substance from a small bottle. He did not explain what the substance was. He did not invite questions. He moved with the focused efficiency of a man performing a task he took seriously, and when he was done, he blessed the house and the barn and the livestock pen and the dock. He spent particular time at the dock, at the point where our property met the water. If you have encountered accounts from the Bayou parishes of this period, any written records from Terrebonne or Lafourche from the years around 1903, any parish records that might speak to what the priests of that era were called to deal with. I want to know of it. Leave it below. These accounts deserve to be complete. After Father Arcan's visit, the property was quiet for 14 days. The animals were not disturbed. Brasseur began sleeping at the door again in his normal way rather than against the far wall. The children played in the yard in the afternoons. Celeste began to ease in the shoulders, which was how she showed relief, not in her face which she kept composed, but in the particular tension around her shoulders and neck that had been there every waking moment for weeks. I do not want to give you the impression that it was over. It was not over. On the 15th night, a clear night in late November with a half moon, I woke at approximately the same hour as before, and the smell was there again. This time I did not wait. I woke Celeste. I told her to take the children and go to the Bergeron family, who lived a quarter-mile along the Bayou road. She did not argue. She dressed the children in the dark, and she took them out the back of the house while I went to the kitchen with the shotgun. I want to be precise about what I saw. I went to the kitchen window, the one that looked out over the yard toward the Bayou tree line. I opened the shutter just wide enough to see out, and I looked at the yard. At the far edge of the cleared ground, where the tree line begins, there was a shape. I am going to be honest with you about this. I could not tell you now, and I could not have told you then. Whether what I saw was a trick of moonlight on the Spanish moss, or a shape that had substance and will and intention. What I can tell you is that I looked at it for perhaps 20 seconds, and in those 20 seconds it did not move, and it was looking at the house. Then I raised the shotgun, and I fired at it. I missed, or I hit something that did not care. The moss moved where the shot went, and something moved in the tree line, and then there was nothing there. The sound of the shot rolled across the bayou and came back from the far bank and died. The yard was empty. The smell was there for a few more seconds, and then it was gone too, dissolving into the bayou air, and I stood at the window with the gun and the smell of powder smoke, and the yard was empty and I was shaking. I do not know what I saw. I want to be clear. I do not know. I have spent 20 years with that question, and I have not come to a resolution that satisfies me. What I know is what the evidence showed. The smell was real. The tracks on the porch were real. The mark on the shutter was real. Brasseur's behavior was real. The sound outside the door was real. The marks on the livestock were real and were not made by any animal I could identify. And I showed them to 3 men who knew this bayou country as well as any men alive, and not one of them identified them either. In the days after the final night, I spoke again with Father Arcand, and I spoke with Donat Fontenot. And I wrote down everything I have told you, here in a household ledger that I kept until the ledger filled. Fontenot told me he had heard of no other incidents on the bayou in the period following the priest's second visit. Father Arcand told me that he had submitted a report of the incident to the diocesan offices in New Orleans, in terms he described as general and prudent. I do not know what became of that report. I have not looked for it, though Alcide, who is writing this down, tells me he might be able to find it. I would not be surprised if it cannot be found. Reports of this kind, in my experience, tend to be filed in places from which they do not easily resurface. The livestock deaths stopped after the night I fired the gun. I do not attribute this to the gun. I am inclined to attribute it to the intervention of Father Arcand, or to some cycle of the thing itself that I do not understand, or to some combination of the two that does not require me to choose between them. What I know is that after that night, it did not announce itself again. And I have thought, sometimes, in the dark of other winters and in other houses, whether the absence of announcement is the same as absence. It is not a question I have answered to my satisfaction. I have not been back to the Bayou birth property. My son Théodule sold it in 1919 after I moved to my sister's home in Homer. I asked him not to describe the property to the buyers in detail. I do not know who lives there now, or if anyone does. I do not know if what came to the property in 1903 still considers it a place of interest, or if places hold that kind of interest for things like what I encountered, or if the interest passes when the people pass. These are not questions I know how to answer. I have put them to every man I have trusted with this account, and no one has known. The Cajun people who carry this knowledge deepest have their explanations, and the priests who carry it another way have theirs, and neither set of explanations is entirely satisfying. And I have come to believe that may be the point, that the thing exists precisely in the gap between explanations, in the place where frameworks fail. What I believe. Insofar as I believe anything about this, there is something in the Bayou country that the Cajun people have known about for as long as they have been in the Bayou country, and perhaps longer. They brought the name from somewhere else, and perhaps the thing it means moved with them, or perhaps the name fit something that was already there when they arrived. The stories are not entertainment. The warnings are not superstition. The process the priests learned and did not teach openly and applied when they had no other tool is not theater. I know this because I saw the result of it, and the result was real, and it has to be accounted for. I have spent 20 years trying to build a structure of understanding around those 3 weeks in 1903 that does not require me to accept the thing the old people accepted without. Apparent difficulty. I have not succeeded. The structure keeps finding the same gap at its center, where the thing that stood at the tree line in moonlight was, where the sound outside the door was, where the smell was sweet and wrong and patient, the smell of something that knew how to wait. It waited 11 days before it came to the house. I do not know what it was waiting for. I do not know if it got what it came for in the end, or if Father Arcand's work was sufficient, or if something else decided the matter entirely. I know only that it came, and it was real, and I have been honest in this account to the best of my ability, and I am an old man now, and I am tired of carrying it alone. May whatever is still out there in those waters stay there. These accounts do not disappear on their own. They need witnesses. If you are willing to be one, subscribe to the Dark Archives. And if this account found you, if it named something you have heard, or encountered, or suspected, leave a word below. Say you were here.